Good afternoon. My name is Paula Kalinowski. I'm a water resources engineer at Emmons and Oliver Resources. And thank you for coming to this talk about stormwater management alternatives for solar garden sites. Here's a brief overview of the presentation I'll be giving. I suspect that many or most of you have solar projects that have gone in your watershed. You may find that solar sites and the stormwater management that's appropriate for them doesn't quite fit into doesn't quite align with standards for urban development, stormwater management standards for urban development. And when you look at it from a rural perspectives, there's some places where it doesn't really align there either. So it's kind of its own new set of questions that are coming up, and this presentation is just kind of going back through what's some of the background on solar sites, the regulatory context, maybe some things that you want to think about as you are reviewing your rules and thinking about how they apply to solar garden sites. So, typical solar garden setting. I have noticed a lot more interest in solar sites being developed on marginal land other than agriculture, sort of brownfields. We hear, brownfields, greenfields, bright fields. There's a lot of interest in those, but by far and away, the majority of solar sites that we've seen in Minnesota and that I've worked on have been on leased agricultural land, and that's most likely what you're going to run into. And you may also be hearing a lot about the benefits of solar energy generation, besides the benefits of reducing greenhouse gas. And I absolutely agree that there are many potential co-benefits, but I want to be careful not to oversell those right away, because they're not necessarily guaranteed. So for example, many solar sites have, they're going to be planting native perennials as part of the Bowser pollinator pledge. They either take that on voluntarily, or perhaps that standard has been adopted by the LGU. And so we think, yay, we're going to get this native prairie on this solar garden site, and it'll be great all around. But if it's well implemented, then yes, we may get these benefits that we're providing habitat for pollinators. We're putting native perennials with those deep roots onto the land and rebuilding soil health by building soil structure and biomass. And that can have high benefits for hydrology, right? That increases our stormwater volume retention on the land. But if that vegetation plan isn't well implemented, then maybe we don't get those benefits. So, it's on well-managed sites that we can get some additional benefits. And so I'm not trying to sell snake oil here, but I think when you look at your your stormwater rules and performance standards, think about what you can do to ensure that you're providing a space for these benefits, right? We want to get the most out of this solar site that we can in terms of environmental benefits. So the solar energy field is still relatively young, and as such it poses some new questions for various scientific disciplines, and has sparked a lot of research recently. One of the most interesting pieces I have come across is a study that's been funded by NREL, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. That study is on solar site hydrology. It's the University of Minnesota, Great Plains Institute, and Fresh Energy are all participating in that study. It is one of the goals of that study is to develop some curve number recommendations for solar sites. So the study looks at, I think it's 6 or 8 sites across the US, and they are monitoring runoff for a 2 or 3 year period. I know they've completed at least 1 year of monitoring. And at the end of their monitoring period, they will provide recommendations for solar site CN. So that will make my life easier, I think, and hopefully yours too. Other pockets of research in ecology and habitat benefits from solar sites. Interesting stuff about the microclimates that develop under and around solar panels and how that may or may not impact vegetation on the sites. So here's a little of the regulatory background. This is kind of what I would walk into when I've got to work on a civil site design for a solar site. The Minnesota construction stormwater permit is almost always going to be triggered for these sites. If it's a community solar garden site, there will be, that's generally a 1 megawatt site. There's enough, large enough number of panels that the panel surface area is going to be at least 1 acre sum total. And so that's going to trigger the construction stormwater permit, which is most often the standards to which we are being held when we work on civil site design, because a lot of the projects are rural, and those rural townships probably follow the county is the LGU, and the county may have adopted MIDS or just the construction stormwater permit for their stormwater management standard. And for the most part, I would say the NPDES permit works fine for solar sites. Where you start running into some issues are when we get into sites that have poorly drained soils. And maybe I should say it works well for the most part, except that we're very often working on sites with poorly drained soils, and that makes sense because they're less desirable for other uses. And the reason that that can be problematic is that under the NPDES permit in a urban stormwater management setting, that permit guides you to best management practices that are pretty infrastructure intensive if you've got poorly drained soils. But when you think about being out in an agricultural field and converting to solar, sometimes that it just starts to not quite make sense. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. With respect to watershed district rules, those have come into play from time to time. Stearns County comes to mind. If you're looking at how your stormwater management standards work, I would say if your standards are centered around like an annual volume control or a pre-post volume control, pre-post pollutant load control, that is probably a reasonably easy standard to follow for a solar site. When you start having to treat a specific water quality volume the way that the NPDES permit does, like 1 inch of runoff, 1 inch of runoff from new impervious surfaces, or requiring specific pollutant removal efficiencies, those can sometimes not make as much sense. Another thing is to kind of look at and see is, do your standards address soil compaction at all? Because again, vegetation management, site management, those are really key pieces for solar sites, as well as other sites, but I think that's kind of the main, the primary way to manage solar site stormwater runoff is through good soil and vegetation management. So now I want to look at a few common stormwater management rules and how they apply to solar sites. We all know that when you convert land from native vegetation like prairie or forest to urban development or other land uses, it can have an impact on the site hydrology, and it tends to increase runoff volumes and runoff rates. When we look at solar sites, they're a little different than other settings where we add impervious surface because the panels are disconnected. The water runs off, or precipitation runs off of the panels onto pervious areas and has the opportunity to infiltrate before it leaves the site. But the end impact is really going to depend on the quality of that pervious area. So what is being proposed? Are you going to end up with these beautiful deep roots that build soil health, or will the soil be compacted from heavy equipment and the vegetation has difficulty taking root and we don't have what was promised at all? Regarding water quality, again, runoff from solar panels themselves are clean, so you don't really have this concern about nutrient pollution or sediment pollution as long as the pervious areas are well managed. One interesting question that has come up on a few solar sites located in watersheds with trout streams is, do they produce thermal pollution? And so I don't have a 100% well-researched answer on that, but we did have to do some modeling for a proposed solar site. And we used a tool that was developed by St. Anthony Falls Laboratory to look at the heat impact of runoff from solar panels for kind of an extreme heat event. And this was again a case where the land was being converted from agriculture to solar energy generation. And what we found using that tool was that on the one hand, yes, there was some increase in the temperature of the runoff coming off of the solar panels compared to the agricultural field, but because the total volume was reduced compared to the to the agricultural condition, the heat energy that was transported, or the total thermal load, was reduced. So again, thermal energy depends on mass, and by reducing the overall amount of runoff, the thermal impact was mitigated. So tips for permitting. Do what you can to emphasize that site management. Get a robust erosion control plan. Get some oversight where you can. Highly recommend getting temporary seeding going on those sites even before grading happens. Most often, solar developers are going to do as little grading as possible, and so if you can get something growing on the site, it's going to both help mitigate those erosion control problems, but also might make it easier for permanent seeding. They can sometimes overseed over the temporary crop, and you've already got some root system in place to help that vegetation establish. Excuse me. Make sure you get some information about how they will either avoid or manage soil compaction. My understanding is this is not an issue when they're driving piles, but more so when they're installing panels and having to load and unload equipment throughout the site. So that can be a problem. It doesn't have to be a problem. That's a good place to get some information from the developer. What is the best approach for permanent seeding? You should take that into consideration when you're reviewing the plan. Solar sites have a weird geometry compared to urban development. You've got rows of impervious with maybe areas of 12 to 15 feet in between that are pervious, and you need to, manage and seed that area and the area under the panels as well. And sometimes there are runners going perpendicular to panels, and it's just hard to get in those spaces with equipment. So if you do some planning ahead of time to get temporary seeding in place, or even permanent seeding that can be then touched up, you may have a much more success. You may have greater success getting that site established. And I would recommend that you talk to an expert in native landscapes to get more information on that. Who will provide the site maintenance during the vegetation establishment period? Because some developers are not local, that may, you may wonder, well, they're going to go away. Who's going to take care of this? I would take time to make sure there's an agreement in place regarding that, and just, the ongoing long-term maintenance of the vegetation and any BMPs. So another thing to consider when you're permitting is to have a little bit of flexibility in BMP design standards. We've been working with MPCA lately to talk about one of the big hurdles that we run into with solar sites, which is providing stormwater management on sites with poorly drained soils. So the NPDES permit would typically guide you to when you have clay soils, infiltration is prohibited under the terms of the permit, and you would typically move towards a bioretention with underdrain type of BMP. And we've even been kind of boxed into building facilities with liners in them in the middle of what was a cornfield. So you've got maybe bioretention medium, maybe a liner, an overflow structure, a piped outlet, a flared end section, and some riprap. And this is all in probably, you know, what was a cornfield and maybe an agricultural field downstream. And, you know, it doesn't start to add up because why are you doing this? You get boxed into this because if you can't provide infiltration, you should provide filtration to remove pollutants, right? You want to remove sediment and nutrients before that water is discharged. But from a solar site, the water quality piece, as long as the vegetation is managed well, there isn't really a pollutant removal issue to be addressed. It's pretty clean runoff. Again, if the vegetation is managed well. So we've been working with MPCA to come up with some different solutions. Since it may not be 100% clear that vegetation itself will manage the stormwater, you still will want some stormwater BMPs, but what we've been saying is, can you please allow us to do infiltration on hydrologic soil groups D? And they have been very receptive to that because, I mean, they've seen a lot of solar sites being implemented, and frankly, infrastructure intensive BMPs on solar sites may not be well implemented, given that solar developers may not be as familiar with stormwater management. I mean, you need to have a good contractor, etc. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't build typical BMPs. I'm just saying consider the site context. What we're aiming for is something that suits the context of the rural landscape and provides stormwater control in a manner consistent with natural hydrology. So a big depression that evaporates over time can actually do the job sometimes. Quickly, I just want to let you know that if you have other concerns about solar installations, developers do have tools and information to help answer those questions. Don't be shy about asking. They can do a sightline analysis to see whether screening is required. I think sometimes screening vegetation to shield the solar site from view, that can be a little bit burdensome for developers. And really, I think a sightline analysis is a good idea because a lot of times these things are not as visible as you might think they're going to be. They're generally about 5 to 6, maybe 8 feet off the ground. Glare should not be an issue. Most solar panels have anti-glare coatings on them. I know that occasionally it is, but you can certainly ask for clarification there about the type of panel being installed. Solar panels do not contain toxic materials, at least the newer ones do not. The production of solar panels does result in some nasty chemical management, but the panels themselves are largely silicon and aluminum, and the materials are recyclable. That is a developing industry, so you do want to get a decommissioning plan and cost estimate from the developer, but I suspect that given the number of solar installations that are going in, that recycling industry will grow pretty rapidly. So don't be shy about asking for information. There's a lot of really good resources out there right now. I highly recommend visiting the Great Plains Institute website and looking at their model solar ordinance. They've provided that for Minnesota communities and also for other Midwest communities and other Midwest states. When you're looking at that vegetation management piece, you can pull out the Bowser pollinator toolbox and maybe build some of those recommendations or guidance into your permitting conditions. The DNR has some guidance regarding the siting of solar sites. You've got the MPCA calculator for solar panels and just other resources out there to help you in reviewing solar sites. So key takeaways. Solar site stormwater management poses some new questions. Vegetation management is key. Emphasize that right up front, understand how it's going to be implemented, and keep it simple on the stormwater where you can. And with that, I will take your questions. Thank you.